Good evening, everybody. I'm Joan Backman. I'm a psychologist here in the Rehabilitation Care Team at the IWK, and I'm really happy you were able to make time to come out this evening to hear this Psychology for You presentation. We have monthly presentations for the public that different psychologists in our service do, and we thought it might be timely in October to talk about navigating the school system and advocacy for students with special needs. So I'm really pleased you're here tonight. Sorry about the technical delays. Technology is great when it works, but it doesn't always work. Thankfully, we've got a couple of guys here who help me out. We're joined tonight by some participants in Antigonish, in Cantville, New Glasgow, and Truro. So we'll say hello to those folks and happy to have them on board. And there may be some other folks joining us, I'm not sure. I'm going to be talking for a few minutes, and then we actually have a parent here and a teacher, and they're going to be joining us at the end and have a few remarks and also join into a discussion at the end and respond to questions. So I hope that'll add to the presentation. And I thank Sandy and Leanne for being here. Really appreciate it. So let's get started. Whenever you read about advocacy, the word navigating often comes up, whether you're talking about the healthcare system or the education system. And it's sort of an interesting thing to look at in terms of navigating. If we look at what is advocacy, the actual definition is support or argument for a cause. So if you're thinking about it, you are supporting your child in terms of being an advocate for them with the school system, and if necessary, arguing for their cause. That's the dictionary definition. And most things you read about advocacy talk about, as a parent, your goals as an advocate are to ensure that your child receives the best possible education to maximize potential, and at the same time building a positive working relationship with the school. Because if you lose that positive working relationship, it's really hard to achieve that first goal. And I think that's often the fine line that parents find themselves in navigating through the school system is being a strong advocate and supporting, and if necessary, arguing for their child, at the same time building that positive working relationship. So hopefully tonight we'll have some discussion about how that might happen, and you people as parents and advocates probably have some things that you can add to the discussion as well. So I think that navigation is an appropriate term for the art of advocacy, and I was reminded as I was thinking about this of a t-shirt I once saw in a fitness class that a woman had on. I thought it was so appropriate, and it said, life is a journey, not a guided tour. And I thought how apt that is for all of us, because there really aren't signposts for us. You know where you want to get to, but the best way to get there isn't always clear. And it's that way in life. Nobody tells you, take this turn, take that turn. You're just always having to make the best decision you can based on the information that you have. And using the best tools that you have. So the best information, the best compass readings on where you should be going. And you have to accept that changes and detours may happen along the way. So what seems to be the appropriate course at one time may shift or change according to new information that comes in. So I think it really is navigating. It's not a clear course. You know where you're going. You know what the end point is. But how to get there may not always be exactly clear. So why are parents the child's most important advocate? And some parents will say, gee, I don't have a lot of formal education. I really don't know a whole lot about my child's disability. But in fact, parents really are the experts. You know your child best. A teacher knows them for a year, a certain number of hours during the day. If they come to a psychologist like me, I might spend a day with your child, but you really know your child best, and you're the expert. And I think what's also unique about parents is your focus is what's best for your child. Teachers and principals and special ed coordinators have a lot of children they have to worry about and think about, and your focus is on your child. Obviously, you are concerned about other children as well in the school system, but you have that focus, and you're the only one that really has that one focus. And you're also constant. Everybody else changes from year to year. And this was really brought home to me a few years ago when we were doing some transition planning with a family going from elementary to junior high, a young fellow with autism. And all the transition plans were in place, the meetings had been held, and lo and behold, the first day of school, the principal had changed, the vice principal had changed, and the resource teacher had changed. So, square one. So, you really are the constant, and if you can be that advocate, that constant advocate. It's really important. And you always have the long term in mind. You know, the grade 3 teacher is really, they have the long term in mind too, but they're primarily concentrating on this year, grade 3, what are the outcomes, what do I need to teach the children this year, but you're looking towards the long term. And you also have the big picture that, you know, we'll get to this at the very end, but life is not just about school. So you also have that bigger, balanced picture of where school fits in the life of your child. Just want to talk a little bit, this next little bit might be a little bit dry, but I think it is important. Some of you may know this stuff inside out already. Some of you may be new to the school system, and it may be new information for you. So I just thought I'd go through it a little bit, so bear with me. I think it's really important to know what people are talking about when I say learn the lingo. Know what the terms that the people at school, at the school board level, are going to be talking about with regard to your child and your child's program. And these are all available through the Department of Education's website on their document depot. And I'm just going to highlight a few here that are important. The Special Education Policy Manual. It's available in your child's school too if you want to have a look at it, but you can get it online and download it. It goes through all the various steps of the different policies and the rights and responsibilities of parents, those kinds of things. The next one is Transition Planning for Students with Special Needs, which is a relatively new document that the Department of Education put out. And it looks at transition at various points, transition into school, transition from grade to grade, school to school, and the big transition, life beyond high school. And it has some interesting checklists and questions to ask, and I would certainly recommend it. They also have a 2-page tip sheet on transition that if you don't want to print off the whole document, you could certainly look at that. The newest one, and the Department of Education was kind enough to give us 50 copies, which are at the back of the room, is hot off the press, is the Program Planning Process, a Guide for Parents. And it's a really well-written document as well that gives more information than the special education policy. It's a little more detailed and has a few more pointers and tips, and also, you know, questions to ask in preparation for going to a meeting or meeting with your child's teachers. So those are good documents. There are other documents available as well. The other thing to look at is to look at your school board. And we have people from across the province here. It's not just the Halifax Regional School Board that we're dealing with here. There's a lot of different school boards. And it's a good idea to check your school board's website and look under student services or special services and find out what's there. And what you'll find is that the school board documents will parallel those provincial policies, but sometimes include important information about who to contact, any specific regional programs or services that might be available for your child. So that's important. And also, as we'll get to later, they should have parent concern protocols and processes. So if you're not meeting with satisfaction or you're still concerned about what's going on, there should be a protocol and process outlined, which will differ from school board to school board. So that's certainly good reading as well. And again, these should be available in your child's school if you don't have access to the internet. So what about program planning? If we look at the process, Program Planning 101, and again, this is, I apologize if it's a little bit dry, but the first step is screening and identification of the child as a student with special needs. And there's two ways this can happen, of course. One is some of you may have children who were identified far before they went to school, and they already come with a lot of information. You have a lot of information about your child. There may be speech and language reports, there may be assessments, medical assessments, and you really have a lot to bring. And you can start the ball rolling by meeting with the school principal, and they really suggest early the year before, because they really, especially if the child has quite significant needs, they need to be looking at program assistance, to be planning in terms of resource time and that kind of thing. So they really want to know ahead of time, and the school principal is the place to start. And you can request a program planning team meeting. We'll get to that in a minute, but if you have this information coming in, you can certainly request to meet. And it's not just formal information. It's not just the medical reports. It's not just the psychological reports or speech and language reports. It's your own observations about your child, which will be really, really important for the school. So jot those down before you go. As I said, you're the expert on your child. So what about if the special needs that your child has, learning differences or disabilities, don't become evident until after the child has entered school? What's the process here? Well, if you look at the policy, it does say that the process of identification can be initiated by parents or teachers. So if you're meeting with the teacher and the teacher is identifying a problem, that can certainly be carried on. If you are suspecting there's a problem and perhaps the teacher isn't quite as concerned, you can certainly push that and request that you have further meetings and assessment. I often suggest that if you're concerned about your child, don't go for the 10-minute parent-teacher meetings. If there's somebody else knocking on the door 7 minutes in, and you just don't have enough time to chat. So teachers should be very open to you making a separate time to go in and talk to them, where you have more time to talk about your concerns and the child's strengths and needs. And you can request formal or informal assessment of the child's learning abilities and needs. Formal assessment, you have to give written consent for that, and you should be involved in a follow-up meeting to discuss the results of the assessment always. And parents should get a copy of the written report. I don't think that always happens, but you have the right to that in the special ed policy, so you should always get a copy and look at it and have it in your file. If the school says your child isn't a priority for assessment, what do you do next? And that often happens. Parents will often say, you know what, I think my child has a reading problem, they're in grade 2, but the school says there's a list this long for psychoeducational assessment. And your child's a priority for you, but the school might only have a school psychologist or speech and language pathologist at their school once every couple of weeks, and they have to prioritize all the kids in the school in terms of need for that assessment. So there may be other students about whom the school is more concerned. So you can certainly be the squeaky wheel and try to get the grease, and that does happen, but recognize they are stretched, and some people do have to go to having a private assessment done. Sometimes that isn't necessary. Sometimes a more informal assessment by the resource teacher or classroom teacher will direct you to things that can be done to help your child learn better within the classroom. About assessments, I just wanted to put in a few things here as somebody who's spent a lot of their life and working life doing assessments of children. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and we use an awful lot of jargon. We really do, and I would be the first one to admit it. So if you don't understand a term or what the person's talking about, feel free to ask. There was a woman that I supervised as a PhD student in clinical psychology who went back to school after her child who had special needs had become a teenager, and she remembers back before she went back to school, sitting down with a psychologist, and the psychologist using the word cognitive. And she didn't know what that term meant, and still remembered feeling really stupid. This is obviously not a stupid woman, but she felt really dumb because she didn't know what the word cognitive meant. So, I mean, that's something. If somebody's using a word like that and you don't understand, say, what are you talking about, in a nice way? And they will talk about it means thinking and problem-solving skills, and that makes a lot more sense. So don't be afraid to ask. And I think it's also important, a good assessment should relate those areas of strength or weakness, what they actually mean in terms of everyday life at home and at school. So it's not just, I've put a few examples here, processing speed is something you'll see that's often assessed. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's pencil and paper copying speed. So it might affect something like the speed with which your child can get stuff off the board. So that is a more common sense way of explaining that difficulty. Or short-term auditory memory. What does that mean? Well, it might mean your child might have trouble listening to or following instructions in the classroom. Things might have to be broken down 1 or 2 steps at a time. So those kinds of things are important. Visual motor ability is another one that's really hard to explain to parents. It's a term that psychologists often use, and it's really translating what you see down on paper, whether it's drawing or copying, and printing. It can go over into printing and cutting as well. So don't be afraid to ask questions. So just going on to sort of the next step in the process in terms of the policy is exploration of instructional strategies. And these are really specific, supposed to be specific to the student's individual strengths and needs to help the student meet the outcomes for that particular grade level or that particular subject. And these are called adaptations. Sometimes the difference between adaptations and an IPP are not clearly understood, so I'm just going to make just going to go over this a little bit because I think it is an important distinction. There's a number of different adaptations, and these are described in the program planning guide for parents. One might be classroom organizational strategies, and it might be things about how the classroom is managed, how it's organized, how things are written on the board, where things are located, having a peer helper, those kinds of things. There's also what we call environmental strategies, and that might be things like helping the student organize their desk space so they can find things more easily, or where they're seated in class. So if they're at the back of the class, they've got all those distractions in front of them, but if they're sitting at the front of the class close to the teacher, they're more able to process and understand what they're supposed to do. Also, there are presentation strategies or instructional strategies, and that might be things like highlighting key concepts during a lesson, or recapping the previous lesson before the teacher goes on. Or perhaps if the child is having some difficulty reading material on their own that's necessary for a science lesson, the teacher might read some of it out loud. So those would be ways of presenting information in a different way that may be a better match with how the child learns, or drawing their attention to things that might be more important for them to learn. Motivational strategies are also included within adaptations, and that would be things like looking at the child's interests. You know, if they're particularly interested in a particular subject, presenting reading material perhaps in that subject area to get them more interested in reading, and it can go as well into reward systems. Assessment strategies are important often for students with special needs, so that they're being assessed on the same material as the other students, but perhaps in a slightly different way. So an example might be if they're having trouble getting the information down, perhaps to respond in writing to as much as they can, but then have an opportunity to talk to the teacher out loud to find out what else is in their head that they're not able to get down on paper. Reading questions from the exam out loud to the student if they have trouble reading. And extra time is a huge thing for many children with learning differences or disabilities or cognitive disabilities. Often they can get from A to B, but it takes them longer. So it takes them longer to read the questions, it takes them longer to think about the answer and to plan their answer and to get it down on paper or to tell the teacher about it. So that extra time is really often critical. And then there's various resources. There might be what we call assistive technology, perhaps a special type of word processing package that the student can use that will come up with alternative things they might be trying to say, and they can pick one. It might be something like the Kurzweil software where text can be scanned onto a computer and the student can highlight the text and it's read aloud to them. So there's a lot of technology that is available, increasing every year, and various print and book formats, taped books, books on CD, different kinds of things that can be used. So those would be examples, not an exhaustive list by any means, of different kinds of adaptations. And adaptations help students meet outcomes. So what are outcomes? I'm sure you've all heard about outcomes. Do we really know what they are? They're really what students are expected to know and be able to do at various points in their career. So it's what somebody's supposed to know in math at the end of grade 2, or in physics at the end of grade 11, academic physics. And how do you find out what outcomes your child is supposed to meet? You can actually go on the internet again, on the ADNET Department of Education website, and it's not all that clear where to find it, so I went into the search engine and actually put in learning outcomes, and then they all come up. So if you're interested in, perhaps you have a student who's in grade 4, and just sort of going through and saying, well, what is the average or typical grade 4 student expected to be able to do in math? It might be kind of interesting to look at, because all the report cards now, as you've probably seen, are based on outcomes. You know, meets outcomes all the time or most of the time, and sometimes it's really hard for parents to figure out what that means. So that's something to look at. Just as an example here that I pulled off, a grade 6 math in the measurement area for math demonstrates an understanding of the relationships among the base, height, and area of a parallelogram. And of course, anybody with a spatial difficulty or nonverbal learning disability might be cringing at that. But somebody who has strength in that area might find that part of math very, very easy. So more about adaptations. According to the policy, adaptations should be documented in the student's cumulative file, and that's a file, not the report card, but it's actually a file that goes with your child from grade to grade and school to school. So those adaptations should be documented so that the next teacher or the next school knows what worked for your child. Sometimes these adaptations occur a bit more informally, and I don't think they're always recorded, so I think it's a good thing to ask if adaptations are being used for your student or your child, that they are recorded and they're put in the file. They don't appear on the transcript or on the report card. I think this is an important thing for parents to realize. So if you have a student who's in grade 11 who needs extra time on an exam, or have the teacher go over things orally with them, scribed, that they'll still get a mark for grade 11 English that doesn't say that he had adaptations, okay? It's a little bit different for an IPP. We'll get into that in a minute. So adaptations are perfectly fine. You can still meet those outcomes with those adaptations. The program outcomes are the same. Okay, and according to the policy, adaptations should be monitored on an ongoing basis and reevaluated at least once a year. So if your child is on adaptations, you should be asking to meet with the school to review what's working. This is the list of adaptations we started with at the beginning of the year. What seems to be working? What are you seeing at home? What works at home? What works at school? Are there any other things we should be trying? Are there some adaptations that aren't working that should be dropped? So that is, I think, important to look at. And adaptations can be used for exams and provincial exams. And I just put in an exception here because this is a little bit confusing for some folks, and I think it was probably confusing for me when I first heard it. There are certain benchmark assessments that the Department of Education does. For example, grade 6, they want to see how well kids in general are reading. So it's the grade 6 literacy assessment. They're not so much interested in how your particular child does, but kids in general, to kind of benchmark where the system is. And if they're really looking at reading skills, it wouldn't make sense for them to give your child an oral exam because they really want to look at how well your child reads. If they're looking at your child's ability to do science and a science exam, then it makes perfect sense to do adaptations because what you're really trying to get at is how well the kid can do science, not how well they can read. So often it's the purpose of the assessment that determines whether or not adaptations can be used. And another important point that a parent brought to my attention is for provincial exams at the end of grade 11, grade 12, it's really important those adaptations have been documented. They may not agree to give your student extended time or oral testing or whatever if that hasn't been a typically used adaptation for them previously in school. So there's another good reason to get it documented and to have it written down. And I don't think that's all that commonly known. Again, it's very important for post-secondary planning. If you have a student who, with a learning disability, let's say, who has aspirations of going on to university, as I said, those adaptations won't show up on their high school transcript, but having a documentation of what adaptations were required will be really helpful in getting those same adaptations in the university setting or even in the community college setting. So if they need help with note-taking, they need extra time, it makes it a lot easier to argue for those things if you have some documentation that these, in fact, were used in the high school and were found to be effective and help the student meet the outcomes so that they are looking at post-secondary education. So what if adaptations are not enough to allow the student to meet the outcomes? And this is often something that comes up at different points in a student with special needs school career. Is in the early grades, it's often possible to incorporate the child or include the child within the classroom with the same general outcomes, but at some point their special needs may be such that they need some different outcomes. They can't fit within that regular outcome. And there's different kinds of IPPs. Some people think they're all the same, but they're not. Sometimes they can be a change in outcomes. So they may be doing language arts, but at a different level. Their outcomes would be a little bit different at a lower level. Same thing in math. They would kind of parallel along with the math, but their outcomes they can't perhaps achieve the outcomes at the grade 6 level, but they're maybe achieving outcomes at a lower grade level, at a grade 3 level, let's say. Sometimes there's certain outcomes that a student just cannot reach. It just isn't feasible for them. They just can't. There may be some aspects of the math curriculum, for example, that they can do, and other parts they just can't do at all. So you may have deletion, or where some outcomes you just say, you know what, we're not going there. There's other things that are more important for this student to learn. And there can be addition of outcomes that aren't part of the typical school program. Behavioral programming. Some kids follow the regular academic curriculum, perhaps with adaptations in some areas, but they have a behavioral IPP. Or they may have life skills that are important for them to learn. Program planning team, I just wanted to talk about a little bit. You can see parents are at the top of the list there, and when there is a program planning team meeting at school about your student, you should be invited and you should be there. You're a very important part of the team. It's really important to have a member of the administration there, the principal or the vice principal, depending on the size of the school. Elementary schools, often the principal's there, but VPs perhaps more in the upper grades. Classroom teacher, resource teacher, and if appropriate, the student. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And you may have additional members as required from the school board or the community. So there might be an IWK staff person there, or you might have a school psychologist or speech and language pathologist specialist from the board. Different people do that differently. I'm not sure I want to say if it's right or wrong. It's the teacher that has the responsibility for delivering the educational program. It probably depends on what the topic of conversation is. If you're really talking about how you're going to deal with this child in terms of life skills, and the EPA is very much involved in teaching life skills, it would be very appropriate to have them there. So I don't think I think different school boards have different policies on that. What isn't appropriate is to only send an EPA, and I once had a school conference with school board in PEI where they only sent the EPA to the telehealth conference, and that was not very helpful. There was nobody else from the school there. And of course the EPA didn't have any power to do anything. So what does the IPP look like? Well, there should be a summary of the student's strengths and needs, and that's where you can come in as parents and chime in. Certainly what the school sees is important, but what you see as parents is very important as well. And often you'll see strengths and interests outside of the school system that would be very helpful to share with the school. There's these things called annual individualized outcomes, and really all that means is goals for the year. Where do you hope to be as a team by the end of the year? And then these things called specific individualized outcomes, and those are really the steps to achieving those end-of-year goals. Can also detail some of the services and resources the child's going to get. Who's responsible for what, which is important because you can come up with all kinds of lofty goals, but if nobody's actually working on them, it's not going to happen. Review dates. In the policy, it says it should be twice a year, so that's good for you to know, so you can ask when the next review date is. And there are signatures, and parents are asked to sign the IPP. If you don't agree with the IPP or the placement of your child, there are a number of appeal procedures that can be gone through, and they're outlined in the policy. And there's also, we'll get to a minute, there's other things that you can do if you don't agree with what the school is suggesting. But just to know that you are, it's important for you to be aware of this. Some things to remember. Many students don't need IPPs across the board. They could have an IPP in language arts and perhaps adaptations in math. It's not necessarily an all or nothing thing. And it's not necessarily forever. Some students will stay on an IPP for their whole school career. Some will go in and out, depending on the nature of the school program. And as I said before, you have some students who can meet outcomes in academic areas but have an IPP for some specific areas of need, like social and behavioral skills. For example, there's some children with autism who are very capable academically but need an IPP in terms of life skills or social behavioral skills. The IPP, as opposed to adaptations, an IPP is noted on the transcript. So if you look at a high school transcript, it would say IPP Science. And students with IPPs can now be considered for admission to the community college, which is something relatively recent. It used to be that if you were on an IPP, you couldn't go to community college or university. The community college will now look at students if they have a realistic goal and something the community college feels that they can help them with. If they're able to work reasonably independently, they will look at that. Universities at this point do not accept IPP credits. Communication. We're through some of the dry stuff, hopefully. Important information about your child should be shared from grade to grade and school to school, but never assume anything. And often parents will come and say, well, I just assumed that the school was one teacher was going to talk to the next. And yes, it should happen, but it doesn't always happen. And sometimes it's because, an example I used previously, it's because the staff has changed. And the documentation is sitting in a filing cabinet, but the new teacher or the new VP doesn't know to go and get it. And as you all know, the end of August and early September, they're rushing around and dealing with hundreds of kids. And to know that they have to go and read your kid's file, that may not be the highest thing on their list of priorities. So never assume anything. And I certainly suggest, even though it's a pain, to every year to call and preferably meet with the teachers. Some people like to give the students and teachers a couple of weeks to get to know each other and then go in, so the timing of it may depend, but I think it is important to call. And I think it's really helpful. One of the things that parents can do is, rather than asking them to read the 10-page psychological report necessarily in the first week of school, and I'm guilty of writing those long-winded reports, but people like Sandy will say, Joan, could you please put it in a one-page? You'll take it and put it in a one-page. And a lot of parents have done that, and they've shown me what they've done, and they're excellent. It's a one-pager. This is my kid, and this is what he's like. These are his medical conditions. This is his learning. These are his learning strengths and weaknesses. This is what works. These things perhaps don't work as well, like yelling at my kid or, putting them in the corner or whatever. But these are things that have worked, and that one-pager can be really helpful at getting the teacher through those first couple of weeks so that they don't start off on the wrong foot with your child. And also it's really helpful to find out how the teacher would like to communicate with you. And that's a nice way to put it. You're expecting there will be communication. How would you like that to happen? Would you like us to have a communication book? Do you want to write notes in the agenda? Lots of students, particularly in elementary, they're nice big agendas, so they're easier. Junior high and senior high, there's these little tiny spaces. It's harder to find space to write. A lot of teachers now like email, and they're very good at getting back and forth to people with email. And some people prefer the phone. So I think that's a good thing to find out is how the teachers want to communicate. Just want to talk a little bit about the problem-solving process. And I think it's really important to try to work with the school on small issues before they become big issues. And same thing with your child. I often say that to teenagers I'm talking to. You know what? If you're starting to get over your head, talk to your teacher. Talk to your mom. Don't let it go for 3 weeks. Nip them in the bud and see whether there's another way to work around the problem. Because once you're really into it and everybody's upset and avoiding the situation, it just doesn't work. And I think a lot of it is a problem-solving approach that's sometimes not that complicated. What is the issue? And how can we use what we already know about the child to figure out some strategies which might work? One of the frustrating things I think we sometimes see here is, people will say, my child has to have an assessment at the IWK, and the school has said they can't do anything until you do an assessment, and that's a year down the road. No. Don't accept that as an answer. They have lots of information about your child, and you have lots of information about your child. And using a very common sense problem-solving process, you can figure out some things, at least in the interim, which will probably work. And if they don't, you're going to evaluate it and try something else. Often one of the best things is what's happened in the past, what worked in the past. And I've seen at least 2 cases in the last year of students at the junior high level where parents and teachers panicked because it was grade 9, students going on to high school, and all of a sudden they've got to be able to do it on their own. Let's pull away all the supports, and they're just going to have to grow up really fast. And the student falls flat on their face, and you just go back and say, well, we had visual schedules, we had agenda books, we had these supports at home. put them back in, and lo and behold, the student starts to function again. So often what happened before is a good predictor of what's going to work in the future. And just because they're older, I mean, they may be able to learn to take more responsibility for some of those organizational supports, but taking them all away at once, the sink or swim thing usually, in my opinion, doesn't work very well. If you're going to withdraw supports, it has to be very gradual, and you have to try to teach the student to take more responsibility. You don't just pull it away. And I think that sometimes happens. So when you've got some strategies you think might work, try it and see what happens. Let's try it for 3 weeks or a week or two, and we'll get back in touch with each other. And you know, a lot of the adaptations that are used, they're common sense. Sometimes they're looking at creativity. It doesn't take, a lot of it's not rocket science. And a lot of it you will know as a parent is common sense. And it's sharing that, I think, and making suggestions in a way that's palatable and you're not treading on people's toes, and that may be a hard part. But often it is a problem-solving process. I just want to talk a little bit about organization. We talk about students getting organized. Parents have to be organized too, and it's really helpful when you can have a binder and you put in report cards and copies of medical and educational reports, because you never know when you're going to need them. You know, you're going to a new school and they haven't got the old file yet and you want to have it there, or you're going to apply for a service or a program. Your student's out of school now and they need previous reports. That's really important. And I think it's really helpful to make notes about your child's strengths and challenges and strategies that work at home and at school. Things you observe, just note them down, because sometimes it can come in very helpful. Just as, you know, when I go to see my doctor, I'm always writing down the things I want to ask and get my questions answered. And I think very much the same thing I would encourage parents to do, because when you're in the heat of the moment and your emotions are high, you may not remember that 4 things you really wanted to accomplish in the meeting with the teacher. So there's nothing wrong with making notes. I don't know what I'd do without my lists. And make note of the responses as well. Ask for copies of notes from program planning team meetings to put in your binder. And that's another record of who said what, who's going to do what, and when are we going to look at it again. Just going to talk a little bit about emotional reactions. Most of this I've gotten from parents and from reading about being a parent of a child with a special need. And I don't think we should underestimate that there is a grief process that goes on when you have a child that you had aspirations for and hopes and dreams, and then something happens, whether it's a brain injury or a learning disability or an intellectual disability, and you have to readjust your expectations and your dreams and your hopes. And that is absolutely a grief process, and you go through the anger and you go through all the different stages. And I used to think grief process was sort of linear and you went through the processes like this, but you don't. You keep recycling back and back and back, and you think you've gotten over it, and then it comes back. Something will trigger it. So don't underestimate that at all. This is what I call the mother-father bear reaction. And it was one parent who shared this with me. I thought it was really true. And she said, you know what you have to get over is when the teacher's saying something negative about your child, your first reaction is to go and throttle them, because you're talking about your kid. And it's the old, mother bear protection. And don't you talk, I can say things about my kid, but don't you say things about my kid. And that, I think, I hadn't really thought of it that way till she shared that with me. And she said that was something she really had to try to get over and almost become used to that and not take it personally and on behalf of your child. And certainly optimism is important, balanced with realism, and those are things that sometimes don't become clear until time has passed. What is realistic in terms of expectations and for your child? And of course there's the anger we talked about. It comes with the grief process, and you want what's best for your child, and the school doesn't seem to be responding. And how do you translate that anger into being assertive and getting your message across without alienating the school? The other end of that is somebody who's so apologetic, and I've known parents like that, where they go in, I apologize for being a pain, and I really don't want to ask you to do this, and I feel so badly about asking you to do this, and they're apologizing so much that they're really letting them off the hook. So you want to, along that, there's the 3 A's, anger, assertiveness, and apologizing. You want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be so angry and so apologetic that your message is lost. You want to be assertive, which is not always easy. And I think it's true, and I'm not sure schools always understand this, or hospitals, health centers. They can be very intimidating, especially if you're a parent who has some difficulty in school yourself. I remember going into both my daughters went to Gorsebrook Junior High, and I had a terrible time with a math teacher there in junior high. And I remember going into that classroom, and all those years later, I had those emotional reactions. So it's very, and if you're sitting at a program planning team meeting with all these professionals and you're the parent, it can be intimidating. But don't forget you're the expert, and that will get you through a lot. So the goal is to get points across, your points across, on behalf of your child without damaging your relationship with the school and individuals. That's the hard part. Just some other things that people have told me, and I've certainly read about: getting support from family and friends and support groups. There are Learning Disabilities Association, the Association for Community Living, all kinds of support groups for spina bifida, cerebral palsy, all kinds of people that you can talk to. And parents often say it's talking to other parents who've walked in their shoes that they get the most support and help from. So there are people out there that you can connect with. I think that'll be a tremendous help. Personal counseling and therapy. You know, this is tough stuff that people are dealing with. And people have told me that they have gone and sought counseling for themselves to get through the anger, to be able to deal with some of these issues in a constructive way. And there's no shame in that. It's good to think about treating people in the way you would like to be treated yourself. I mean, you don't want somebody to come in and yell at you, so don't do it to the school. This is a pet peeve of mine. People might disagree with me, but I really don't like it when parents talk disrespectfully about a teacher in front of their child. I've had to kind of get kids out of the way when parents got to get on that tangent and say, you know, this is not constructive, because if your child is thinking that the teacher doesn't know what they're doing and they're an idiot, it's pretty hard to sit there, 5 days out of the week and listen to this idiot, right? So you really have to be careful what you say. And if you want to talk to your husband or your best friend or your mother about it, go ahead. And we all know that there are some teachers that are really, we have a lot of concerns about. But don't do it in front of your kids. And I know it's a hard thing to do. Often people say it's helpful to practice what you want to say. If you have a couple of points you really want to get across, maybe sit down with a friend or support person or somebody from an association that you're dealing with for kids with special needs and say, I really want to get these points across. Can you listen to what I'm going to say and give me some feedback? Does this sound offensive? Does it sound like I'm being unreasonable? Can you think of a better way I could say it? So that's often helpful, to kind of role play it with somebody, to get it out on the table. Take in notes. Don't be afraid to jot down things that, in the heat of the moment you might forget, and even how you're going to approach things. You can take a support person to the meeting. The school does like it if you tell them first. So if you're bringing somebody from an association with you, or your best friend, or your cousin, just say, I'm bringing somebody with me. And often that's helpful, because in the heat of the moment you may not be hearing things accurately, and they may hear things differently, and you can talk about it afterwards. Well, I heard this. What did you hear? Well, no, they didn't actually say that. But in the heat of the moment, you may hear things that perhaps weren't said. Another tip a parent gave me, said, you know what, if you think you're going to lose it, just say, I have to get out of here for a couple of minutes. Can I do that? And leave the meeting or leave the classroom and get yourself, if you can, under control and come back in. You can always ask for a few days to think about decisions. If you feel that you're under some pressure to make a decision about an IPP, or you're going to go an IPP for this or adaptations for that, and you want to think about it, or you want to discuss it with your child, don't feel pressured. Say, you know what, I really need a few days to think about this. I'd like to come back and talk with you next week. And sometimes finding an ally in the school and meeting with them alone is helpful. Often what parents will say is, I have a really good working relationship with the resource teacher at the school. And before I go in with all my guns blazing at the program planning meeting, I will go and talk to the resource teacher and say, this is what I'm thinking. Am I on the right track here? What do you think? And that's really helpful as well, if you can find that kind of an ally. And if you do blow it, forgive yourself and move on. Apologize if you can, and don't give up. What's reasonable? I think this is really hard to do, because you have your own child's interests at heart, and you have to understand where they're coming from without losing sight of your own child's needs. And this became very clear to me a few weeks ago. I was doing a transition meeting with a student going into a high school, and the student had had some kind of a brain injury last year and was going into grade 10, and the resource teacher sat down and she said, to the parent and to me, don't expect me to be a tutor. And they're saying 120 students on her caseload. So you think about that. And think about what that woman's day must be like. Very well-meaning, and she's an excellent resource teacher. I've heard wonderful things about her from parents. But you have to be realistic about what you're going to expect that teacher to be able to accomplish with your student. 120. High school teachers. One of the dads of a student I've seen for years is a high school teacher, and he was telling me, he's got over 100 students that he teaches math to in the high school. And about a third of them are on adaptations or one kind of another. So if you think about managing that, making sure who gets copied notes and who gets extra time and who needs to have the math problems rewritten, that would be a huge management issue for a teacher. We also have to look at outside resources, and there are tutors. The Learning Disabilities Association has the LINKS program, which is a free program providing tutoring. Some YMCAs or schools offer homework clubs. Libraries can offer support sometimes. Some parents, of course, some parents have more resources than others to provide outside tutoring, but I certainly see more and more families looking to supplement what the school is able to provide, which is often sad when you have families who don't have a lot of resources. When all else fails, if you're not getting anywhere with a teacher, one of the things that is often suggested, and it seems like common sense, but it's hard to do, is to let the teacher know you're going to be speaking with the vice principal or the principal. Because if you don't, it looks like you're going right over their heads. And maybe one way to do it is to say, look, we just don't seem to be getting anywhere on this issue. Do you think maybe we could have the vice principal or the principal meet with us together and see if we can come up with something? And if that doesn't work, go to the principal or the VP. If you're not getting anywhere at the school, at each of the school boards there are coordinators of student services that you can go and talk to, and sometimes they can become involved in negotiating or being a bit of an intermediary, or may be aware of other resources that the school board may have, behavior consultants or autism consultants or technical access consultants that the school board has that perhaps the school hasn't accessed to that point. And as I referred to before, the school boards all have processes or procedures for addressing parent concerns, because if you're not getting satisfaction, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get your way, but there are avenues that you can go through to register those concerns. And of course, if there's still no luck with the school board, you can contact the Department of Education, Student Services, and the minister. We've seen in something with that just in the last month or so, where there were a bunch of very concerned parents, and Peggy can probably talk to that better than I can, who were very concerned about the gap that students with special needs used to be able to stay in the school system till 21, but now are being asked to leave at the end of grade 12 on their IPP, and their whole group of students exiting high school for whom there was really nowhere to go. And they went right to the Minister of Education, and the Minister of Education said, no, you go back and you ask your school, and you tell the school that your student's coming back in. So that was one situation where the minister actually did have a direct roll back to the school boards. And hopefully it will not only have the schools take more responsibility or assume responsibility once again for some of these students, but really look at some of the transition needs for these students to have something meaningful for them to go to after high school. We're going to get to transition in a minute. I just want to say a bit about self-advocacy. What is it? Well, ideally you want to work yourself out of a job. You're not always going to be there. And ideally, particularly for children with disabilities who are able to, you want to involve them in planning meetings where possible and reasonable. And you can involve them in making decisions, particularly when kids get to junior high and even before that. If you're looking at a child with a writing difficulty and you're looking at adaptations to help them keep up with the writing, you can say, well, would you rather use a computer for writing, or would you rather have an opportunity to dictate some of your work to somebody? You give them some choices. It certainly may be that one is more acceptable than another. There's lots of students who don't want to look different in the eyes of their peers. And involving them in some of those decisions, they're more likely to buy in. Can your child, if they're able, summarize his or her learning differences? This is really important at the junior high and senior high level, where you're not going to be there all the time. And the resource teacher does have 120 kids on her caseload. It's important for your student in grade 11 to be able to say to that classroom teacher, you know what, I'm really good at this, I have a hard time with this, and this really works well. Can we figure out a way to make it happen? And having this summary is really important, sometimes even having them written down on a cue card. You can do that. And it's a skill. It needs to be taught. You can practice and role play at home. I know some parents that will sit down with their kids before a program planning meeting and say, okay, Johnny, what's really important for you? What's not working right now and you'd like to have it work better? Let's write it down. Let's practice what you're going to say. And then have them come into the meeting and say their piece. And this is a lifelong skill. I mean, this is just as important as reading and writing and math. If you can go in the job and say, you know what, I can do this job that I've applied for. I might need to do it a little differently, but I can do the job. And these are the adaptations I need, and have a good understanding of that. It's a really important thing. And coaching how and when to approach teachers. You know, have a student who complains, oh, the teacher never gives me notes, never remembers to do that. Well, maybe they have a lot of other students they have to think about. You can coach that student to go up to Mrs. Jones and say, Mrs. Jones, when would be a good time for me to come and talk to you about this issue? When would be the best time for me to come and get the notes and copy them myself? Is there another student I can get notes from? So ways to approach a teacher when they have the time to talk to you and in ways that are likely to get a positive result. That is a life skill. I used to tell my 21-year-old that sucking up was a life skill. She wouldn't believe me for the longest time. I think she's finally getting it. But it is. I mean, that's what we do in our work lives and everywhere else, so learn to do it at school. And teachers and resource teachers can be involved in this. They can help to teach those skills and to be receptive to students making efforts in that way. It's really helpful. I've even seen self-advocacy written into IPPs. So, you know, it's a skill. Transition, I'm just going to talk about very briefly because I know we're running out here. As I said before, transitions can be at all different levels of the school system. And the transition plan is developed through the program planning process and can be part of the IPP. And transitions are also important if you're on adaptations, not just for students on IPPs. If you have an IPP, it's a bit of a red flag for the receiving school that you need special attention. But if you have adaptations, the receiving school should also be aware of that. The big transition, of course, is school to community. It's school to whatever comes next. And, of course, everybody's saying now you have to start early. You can't do it in grade 12. You've got to start in junior high school. Vocational exploration, I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And what we mean by that is exploring the things you like to do and the things you're good at. Could be volunteer experience, supported or otherwise. It might be leadership opportunities through Rec and Leisure, through HRM. It could be a mentor, being a mentor in a school system to a younger child with a disability. It could be paid or unpaid work experience. I know lots of parents who have a family member who owns a fish plant or a packaging company, and they pay the young person to go in on a Saturday for 2 hours and learn a skill. And sometimes it's the parent who actually pays the cousin to pay the individual, the young person with a disability. But what it teaches them is showing up for work, taking direction, learning a skill, and feeling good about it, and getting paid. And then they can learn about banking and debit cards and PIN numbers and all that kind of stuff. Through the school system, they have cooperative education courses. There's a new program now, Options and Opportunities, which the Department of Education is rolling out. It's not specifically designed for students with disabilities and special needs, but for some students it might be an option looking at. Through this, it is an academic program, but students have an opportunity to go out and experience different kinds of work settings. So that's a really positive thing. So really looking at interests and aptitudes, Limitations and adaptations in real-world settings. You're in a much better position to see what's realistic after finishing high school. Is it going on to university, community college? Is it supported employment? Is it community employment? Is it volunteer work? What is realistic? And some questions to consider, of course. It's not just education, it's also leisure. Is it independent or supported living? Is it employment? And what skills and abilities will my child need to access these options? Do they need to know how to use public transportation? Do they have to be independent in personal hygiene? Know how to get to work or school on time? These are all extremely important. And thinking about what your child may need when they're through school may help to develop some of the IPP goals or even goals at home and in the community. We had some people here from Bloorview Children's Rehab the last 2 days talking about transitions, and they were talking to some parents in the same room last night, and one of the parents said, well, how can I get the school to start working on life skills? And the speaker turned it around and said, well, you can start working on life skills at home. Parents have the primary responsibility for teaching life skills, and you can certainly get the school to help out with that, and you can get community recreation and leisure involved in that, but it's a shared responsibility. We don't say somebody else does it. Just some thoughts to end with, and then I'm going to be quiet and let Leanne and Sandy say something. Don't forget you are the expert on your child, and you'll always be your child's best advocate. And this too shall pass. There are years, you know, if you follow kids over years and you work with families, there's some years that are just awful. And the next year you get a teacher who clicks with your kid and you're going to have a great year. So sometimes that'll get you through a bad year, is to know that things may get better, and there are cycles to the education system. And finally, I just wanted to leave something I believe very strongly in, that you as the parent are in the best position to provide balance in your child's life. And school isn't everything. And if you look at the long run, it's social relationships with other people, it's vocational skills, it's social skills, it's independent living skills. All those things are just as important to long-term outcome. Doing chores. There's things that you can do at home to encourage the child. It's not just reading, writing, and math. And if I think sometimes if the child gets the message that school is important, but it's not the only thing in life, if they have learning difficulties, then there's other areas they can shine in and be recognized within the family. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm going to leave it at that and let these ladies come up and say a few words, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. And I'm hoping these guys can help me out.